listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
And we are live from America and just outside the Matrix. It is time once again for the show that brings you the truth behind the headlines. I'm investigative journalist Lee Stranahan, and this is The Backstory. So anyone watching on video, there is no video on my end today, and it's a complete mystery. I have no idea why. Nothing changed yesterday, although I'll tell you what did happen. Our intrepid producer Rod is here in the house. Hey Rod, how you doing today?
Doing good. How about yourself?
Well, my apartment flooded at 1 in the morning. It was pretty disconcerting. I got up and I walked into the hall and my feet were soaking wet. And simultaneously, this is a little weird, I heard that cop knock on the door. You know the knock I'm talking about. Cops have a special knock. It's not rhythmic. It's just they pound the door. You know what I'm talking about, right?
Boom, 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 boom. Yeah.
Yes, I heard one of those as my feet hit the wet floor. And the cops were there because the downstairs neighbors had been getting flooded from me, from, I guess, up here. It seems like a pipe backed up or something like that in my bathroom. And my whole floor was flooded, completely, totally flooded. But I don't think that affected the video because even though, and I've had it turn off, they've got like 4 fans, and it would be, Saul would get very upset at me because he'd go, what the hell, are you inside a dump truck? Because it kind of sounds like that. But that's going on, but it didn't affect the video setup at all. So I am at a complete loss as to why we don't have video, but we in fact don't have video, so sorry. And the sad thing is Saul sent me a picture. So hopefully on Tuesday, because we're off Monday for Martin Luther King Day, it's a federal holiday. Hopefully on Tuesday, we'll have video back and video and an image of multifaceted engineer Saul that will say multifaceted engineer Saul on it. That's what it's going to read. That's what we're hoping for. How's that sound? Is that okay with you, Saul?
Yeah, that sounds awesome. Great.
Okay, there we go. There's the slightly delayed voice. I worried for a second because, again, that would be a sign of things going very badly. But we got a great show today that our intrepid producer Rod has put together. Rod, it's a Southern show, isn't it, y'all?
Yeah, that was kind of the theme of the show today, and it goes along with our guest co-host who's waiting in.
Where's he waiting?
He's here. He's right. He's
okay,
waiting for you
so
to introduce him.
Then I will. Today is the first day of Frosty Fridays here, where Mark Frost, coming at us from Georgia, is going to be co-hosting all episode. Hey, Mark, how you doing?
Greetings. How you doing?
Well, aside from the flood, I got a snare stand today, so we can talk about that in a second.
That's exciting. See, that's real news to me. That's the kind of news I like to consume.
Yes. See, I got a snare because I had my 14-inch snare, electronic snare that I got. That's a real, because I was going on the Elise's electronic kit that I had. I had an 8-inch snare, and I'm not that coordinated, Mark, I'll be honest with you. So I would always hit the wrong thing. I would accidentally side stick. Does that make sense?
Yes. Which is why you should start off, that is, while you're developing skills, you should have a small snare, like a 10-inch.
But the Elise's Nitro kit, which is what I had, it's not even a 10-inch like on practice pads. It's an 8-inch with a big rim. Does that make sense? The rim around the side is big. So literally, and I'll tell you, to me, whacking a snare drum, it's not as much fun if you've got to be careful. Does that make sense? I want a large target.
Yeah, but I'm a big snare drum fan, so it's definitely my favorite drum.
Yeah. So anyway, I got this 14-inch that I bought off eBay, like $100, a good deal, a mesh head 14-inch snare drum.
Awesome.
And but I needed a stand for it. So today I had my girlfriend go and pick me up. I paid for it. I didn't make her do that work, but she drives. So she went over to the Guitar Center and picked me up a snare stand. And then we couldn't get it together, but then I got it together. There was one part that wouldn't go into another part.
Ah.
But I got that figured out. And so now my kit's getting there. It really is. So we got entrepreneur, economist, and prog rock drummer Mark Frost joining us all episode on a Southern episode. Let me explain, Mark. Our first guest is the great Jamie Lovegrove. He's a reporter down in South Carolina who is completely tuned in, and there's a lot of famous people, aside from Lindsey Graham and Tim Scott and Nikki Haley, all hail from South Carolina. But South Carolina is in the news for politics quite a bit. Now, where you are in Georgia, they're in the news more because Joe Biden was there this week. And that's one of the issues we'll talk about, his disastrous speech. And it was a disaster, by the way. People are calling it that for exactly the reasons that I said the other day. Then in the second hour, we have a gubernatorial-ish announcement. When I say gubernatorial-ish, I mean lieutenant governor is governor-ish, right? That's gubernatorial-ish. You're in the gubernatorial branch, at least. I don't know exactly.
Yeah.
Do you know, if someone asks you to state clearly what a lieutenant governor does, do you know, Mark?
I think I do. I've always thought you wait and hope the governor dies.
That's good. That's good. Well, we'll ask Albert Guillory about that, the great Albert Guillory, coming at us from Louisiana. So we've got you in Georgia. We've got Jimmy Lovegrove in South Carolina and Albert Guillory in Louisiana. I would say that's a Southern spread right there. We've pretty much got a...
And that sounds...
Right?
Yes, it sounds fascinating to me. Yeah, I'm excited.
Yeah, it's going to be great. And we got more coming up right after I get to the boom. See, it's fun to do the boom. Just say the name of it. Watch this. You can do it, Mark. This is one of your lieutenant co-host privileges.
I'm the lieutenant governor now, waiting for you to die.
Say a lot of people are, but just say the name of the show and watch.
This is The Backstory with Lee Stranahan.
See, as soon as you say the name of the show, you get the boom, and it's kind of sound effects-alicious. You see what I'm saying? I like it. So, one of the things I said, we had Daniel Lazar yesterday, great segment with Daniel, and I said that I think the economy is going to spell nothing but trouble for Joe Biden and the Democrats this year, as they're almost certainly going to lose the House and the Senate. I think because the economy is on a path, as you've been predicting and warning for over a year on this show and other places, Mark, inflation's coming. Yes. And sure enough, the producer price index, whatever that, I'd never even heard of that. But it makes sense to me that since there's a consumer one. So I guess the cost of manufacturing goods is going up too. Is that correct?
Absolutely. And in some cases, in some sectors, the producer index is outpacing the consumer index because there's a lag between the time that a producer's prices go up and the extent to which they can transfer that price on to consumers. And it depends on the good. If the good is a necessity, they can transfer most of that increase on their costs onto the price. But if the good is not a bona fide necessity, if people have alternatives to buying that, if there's competition within that genre, often it forces producers to go out of business or to severely retard their production because the costs are too high.
You got to watch out with that because Daniel McMaster was actually banned for using that word, the R word you just used. But I think you put the emphasis on the correct syllable, so I think you're safe. But, you know, some people get sensitive about that. Now, the thing, we're talking about necessities, but I would argue, Mark, and this takes me into one little news headline that I know you'll like, that I just found out about. Recently, the Consumer Electronics Show happened in Las Vegas. That's the big CES, is where they announced a lot of new products. One of the things that was announced there from the pinball manufacturer Stern, have you seen the Rush pinball machine?
I have not.
So now, again, some may call this a luxury good. Some may call it a necessity. Stern announced at CES a pinball machine that is thematically based on the Canadian power trio Rush. And it's got like the first album, which was not Rush as we know it, because John Rutsey was the drummer on the first album, not Neil Peart. But still, that first album logo, the Rush lettering in the lettering from their first album, has become sort of the iconic Rush lettering. They use different lettering pretty much every album. Did you notice that? There was no set Rush logo for 40 years.
Yeah, I absolutely did. You know, and Rush has one thing you and I have in common is our absolute love of Rush. So
I would say that could be a necessity. When I saw it, I'm like, I need that. And so it's a pinball machine, and it's got the picture that they went with for the band, too. I think this is very smart of them, was the band circa 1977, when Neil had long hair and the big mustache and everything. Yeah. And but that first album, you know what I'm saying, the lettering on the first album, the very flourishy Rush, I don't know how else to put it, is the logo they went with. And at one point, if you put your ball in the right place, your pinball, stops all, there's nothing, I can say that. The FCC can't stop me. But if you put your pinball in the right place, you get a drum solo. They've got a little tiny Neil doll, and he flails around more like Keith Moon than Neil Peart, I would say, because he's a little spazzy, but still good enough. So anyway, the Rush pinball machine has just come out. Now, again, you see what I'm saying? Some might consider that a luxury good, but for those such as you and I, if we had a couple grand extra burning a hole in our pocket, I couldn't stop myself from getting that, because it's got to be a couple grand. It's a full-size pinball machine.
Yeah. I mean, I like that too. Now, if it, you know, that would be just a cool thing to have in your house.
Exactly. With all the custom lighting I have, as my now 12-year-old son once said, my apartment is lit like a strip joint, by which he means it's very dark, and I like the colors blue and purple in lighting, so I use a lot of those. There are no strippers, but he's kind of right about the lighting. And just because I like colored lighting in the apartment. So the pinball machine across from the entrance as one of the first things you see lit up across the room in the dark, a Rush pinball machine. Picture that for a second, Mark. You can see that'd be nice to come home to, right?
Absolutely, and it'd be good bragging rights with your friends, because your friends would come. I would come over, and I would want to play it.
Well, you're invited any time. Just to hang out, or try the electronic kit. The cool cymbals and floor tom are not here yet. I'm still waiting for those. A company up in Quebec makes those. But with prices rising, it seems to me politically, the Biden administration doesn't know what to do about it. They're trying to pretend they're talking about all these other issues. But I got to say, if, you know, when things cost people more and gas is like $3.50 a gallon in the cheap parts of the country, I think people have bigger concerns than even the hubbub about voting rights. So do you see any is any white knight coming for the economy that the Biden administration can look? Is there anything coming? If COVID were declared, if they declared victory on COVID tomorrow and said, we won, we've defeated COVID, this Omicron variant is not particularly dangerous, and they declared victory, you know what I'm saying? I'm stealing that phrase they use in the military. Do you think that it would have an immediate, by immediate I mean before the election, rebound effect on the economy? Mark Frost.
No, I think that for the foreseeable future, I'm pretty bearish. Whether that bear fully starts growling in a month or 3 months. And as you know, I've been pretty correct on these things over the last year and a half, 2 years. And, you know, when the pandemic started, we were awash with capital. So I was on a variety of shows and television stations talking about what kind of stimulus that we needed. And I argued that we didn't need any stimulus. What we needed was to take care of folks that we were, through our own choice, that is shutdown choices, we needed to take care of folks who depended on their jobs to eat and to take care of the working poor, since we were removing their jobs from so many of them. So that was sort of the argument. And I think I said it right at about a year and a half ago, the time's coming soon when the American people are going to stop worrying about COVID so much, and they're going to be much more worried about our reaction to it. So if you look at what we've done, we've increased the money supply by over 1/3. That is inflationary by definition, and by definition, it is not transitory. That is permanent reduction in the purchasing power of money. And there's no getting around that. It's not complicated. If you print a bunch of money, its scarcity becomes less, and it buys less. We learned that from Zimbabwe. We learned that from the Weimar Republic in Germany. Anytime countries start printing money to pay their bills, the purchasing power of the money goes down. Now, there's the other stimulus, then there's the other quantitative easing, if you will, and that's the Treasury Department. Because whether you're printing money or whether you're printing Treasury bills, the impact is pretty much the same. And it sends out expectations to the market. When you drive interest rates down to the point where that real interest rates are negative, it pays to go buy a house, more house than you can afford, and you can get a negative rate on an adjustable rate mortgage in terms of real interest rates. And all that has done is it's forced people to go into real estate. It's bid the price of housing up. And in 2 to 3 years, we're going to have a bubble in that. The Fed's already sending the signal that it's going to have to slow down the party pretty soon. We can go back to the mid-'70s to see how the Fed has to do that. It isn't like they're going to be raising interest rates by 1/4 of a point. They're going to be raising interest rates by full percentages every 3 months or so. And if you go back to the late 70s, the Paul Volcker Fed had to get interest rates up to about 20% to stop people from buying stuff on credit. And all that does is it chokes the economy down, and the people least able to weather it are the people who suffer. And that's my gripe about all of this. And if I have a gripe about the Biden administration, I feel, and I judge them as just gaslighting the American public to the point where I could see a regular, normal person not trained in economics wondering if they were crazy. Because what the administration's saying and what is in reality true is so disconnected, it actually worries me. And in the big, long picture of things, capitalism works by faith. You have to have faith in the rule of law, in the general game of things. You have to believe that it's not completely rigged against you. And we've turned into a country where it's us against them, you know, this group against that group. And everybody's out seemingly just selfishly trying to dig out, you know, what's theirs, and using government in a rent-seeking way. And all we mean by that is people are selfishly using government to make themselves rich. And I see it across the economy. And so I'm very worried about it. I don't think I've ever been as worried about my country as I am right this moment as I'm talking. If you look at the fundamentals, everything is overvalued. Everything is inflated. And if you have any gray hair on you at all, you know what happens when you have bubbles and when things are inflated and when things are overvalued, they drop. And when they drop hard, and there's casualties involved.
Well, and I just think about this from a practical standpoint. Like, for instance, and you're an entrepreneur yourself, and you're in favor of entrepreneurship. But if you had
Absolutely,
a friend,
I'm a capitalist.
If you had a friend who was thinking about doing something to open a traditional small business in America, like a restaurant, I would advise them, even in South Dakota, where I am, think of all the problems if you were going to open a restaurant today. Number one, you can't find people to work there. That's everywhere. We're seeing it here in South Dakota. So for whatever reason, a lot of people don't want to work at your restaurant. But second, I'm not worried. I think if as an entrepreneur, I am more worried about the government's reaction. We just had the Supreme Court decision that struck down the employer mandate. They kept the healthcare worker mandate, which is interesting. It's a different league of employee, I guess, but whatever. The government's already into the medical system. So they struck down the employer mandate. But I would be worried that if I built a business, that the Biden administration's not going, well, that didn't work, so we give up. We'll never do that again. I would worry about the government just out of nowhere with no medical reason, but because they felt pressure to do it, doing things that would, aside from the fact that a lot of people don't want to go out to eat now, let's say. But if you had a friend who was trying to go into the restaurant business, you eat as a capitalist, as an entrepreneur, you'd have to tell them they're a little nutty right now, correct?
Yes. The last thing I would want to go open, I mean, there's an exception to anything generally you say, but the last thing I would want to go into right now is the restaurant business. Even in good times, about 90% of them fail within 3 years. So it's a high-risk business to go in. Most people go in it for the wrong reasons anyway. And right now, there's so much uncertainty in how that's, because who knows? And it might depend also on the state you're in. I mean, imagine you go get a loan for some money and you open up a restaurant and they close you down. And business works off of certainty. And so when the government is in chaos, capitalist business processes go into disarray because people can't count on the future. I don't mean it in the political sense, but economic behavior is conservative in the sense that people look out into the future and they say, okay, you have to be able to be an entrepreneur. You have to believe that the space that you're going to be playing in next month is going to be predictable, at least in the big schema of things. You don't, if you think there's going to be a revolution, to use an extreme example, you're probably not real interested in investing your capital right now. You're probably going to wait and see how things go out. Well, if you wonder what law is going to be passed this week versus last week and how people are going to feel about this or that and whether your customers are going to be allowed to come see you or not, if you have to worry about those things, that adds additional risk. And from an entrepreneur's perspective, there's a certain amount of return I want to get on my invested capital. If I can't get that, let's make up a number. Let's say I want to make 20% or it's not worth it to me because I have to put my own time, energy, and sweat into it. So if I can't make 20%, 15%, if I can't make a required return that I have in my mind, I might as well just go invest the money in the stock market, which is what a lot of entrepreneurs and a lot of entrepreneurial companies are doing. It's why there's so much. That's why I said even 2 years ago, we don't have a shortage of capital in this country. We don't have a shortage of investable resources. In fact, we have a surplus. And that's one of the reasons why certain sorts of assets have been bid up pretty crazy. Even where I live, which is out kind of in the Hicks, it's the far outskirts of Atlanta. You know, shacks that used to sell for, I'm serious, $70,000 now are selling for $150,000. And that's because of cheap money.
And this may sound like one of those dumb things I say frequently, but I'm really sort of serious here. Do you know what business I think would be smart? And I'm curious about your opinion on this. Marijuana delivery. Because in D.C., there's a lot of places that will deliver weed to you. In South Dakota, there's none.
It is, but let me tell you what the negative of that is, and I know it firsthand because I think you know I own a half of a payments company. And we have a couple clients in California who do that. Well, Visa, MasterCard, and what's called the interchange, which is, so when you use your credit card, that merchant has to belong to an interchange somewhere. And so whoever controls the interchange controls, kind of like the Silk Road, they control the pathway from that merchant to whoever the issuing bank on that credit card is. Well, it's highly competitive except in weed. So, for instance, let's say you started a grocery store. You'd pay interchange plus maybe 20 basis points, 0.2%, over and beyond interchange. And the payments company that would connect you to the interchange, they would get that 0.2%. Well, with weed, people have recognized that it's not competitive and you have the people captured. So it's not uncommon for weed to have a 10% interchange, a interchange plus 10% charge on that, because the big banks won't play there. All of the big banks still won't do weed because it's technically illegal federally. And so just getting even, in fact, I have a prospective client right now that can't even get a weed merchant account where he can accept credit cards because not one bank in the whole state will give him one, because they're still paranoid about it being illegal federally. Because think about it. Let's say you do $5 million of business in a year, and all of a sudden the government, the feds say, you know what, we're going to start enforcing marijuana laws. And they're going to say, well, technically, my company, I mean, if they wanted to just push the pen to the paper and live on the letter of the law, I'm not running a payments company. I'm running a money laundering company. You see where I'm going?
I do, yes.
Because I'm taking good money and I'm turning it into bad money, and then I take the bad money and I turn it into legitimate money that goes into somebody's account, and there's actually laws against that, federal laws against that, and it has everybody in the business spooked. So to answer your question,
if they want to see a real insurrection, they should try doing that. They should try enforcing the federal marijuana laws. Forget January 6th. That's when the real insurrection would start. Angry stoners is not what you want. But, Mark, we got more.
Yeah, that's a frightening thing.
Mark Frost is with us all episode, co-hosting. It's Frosty Friday. Coming up next with Mark, we'll be talking to Jamie Lovegrove from South Carolina. And we'll talk about Tim Scott's reaction to his latest Biden speech, the history of civil rights legislation and voting rights in South Carolina, and more, all coming up right after this on The Backstory.
Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
So, Sean, what do you want to talk about today?
Well, Bob, that's easy.
I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No. It's never too late. See, now the leading experts in the field, I mean, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show By Any Means Necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts to stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Feeling kind of blue, but maybe also kind of red, and kind of purple, and kind of alone? You've got a friend on Radio Sputnik. Tune into Political Misfits from 12 to 2 Eastern Time, Monday through Friday, for news, politics, and culture without the two-party bias. Catch us daily on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Or find us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your news.
Are you bored? Are you lonely? Do you need a hug? Well, we can't give you that, but we can keep you up to date on Radio Sputnik.
And we are back on 105.5 FM AM 1390. I'm Lee Stranahan, and this is a backstory. Our rotating guest host this week, he's not rotating himself, just the show does that. Our guest host today, it's Frosty Fridays, Mark Frost, economist, entrepreneur, and prog rock drummer. We're pleased to have him joining us. And Mark, now here's the way it works. You're co-hosting. So just quick co-host lessons. It's pretty easy. You know, I'll talk to Jamie and ask him a question, probably say stupid stuff. And then after I ask him a question, he answers it. Then if you have a question, feel free to throw that in, or comments or anything. You know, kind of be your turn. Does that make sense? And then
it does. So you basically want to, sorry, go ahead.
I warned Carmine towards the top of the hour. As we get towards the top of the hour, I become slightly a control freak only because I'm aware of the time, and I want to make sure we get out on time so Saul doesn't beat me about the face and neck. And so, but at the beginning part of the interview, especially, ask any questions you have for Jamie or fill in comments or whatever. Does that make sense? There you go. Pretty easy.
It does, and you can control away because I've read Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance.
And explain that comment to people who may not have read it.
Oh, that means I have Zen. So when you have somebody around you that's controlling or doing whatever you have, just recognize you can't control everything in life and enjoy the moment. It's the moment that counts. If you don't enjoy your moment, you'll wake up old and just look back and say, I never really lived.
That only happens around 55 after the hour. Because once that starts to happen, I'm aware. No, really, honestly, because then I become aware that this show, we have to be out by 59, basically, especially in the second hour, because there's another show on after ours. And
yes.
Those are the only hard breaks that we have. So then I always worry about that, and I get a little, freaky, because I worry, because I want the show to get out on time, because Saul will tell you. Saul, feel free to agree with me here. I'm very good. I've always gotten us out on time, right, Saul?
Yep, you're always on time.
Even if the music's playing and there's 10 seconds, I managed to say everything in 8 seconds. I'm pretty good about that. So there we go. Joining us now from South Carolina, political reporter and analyst. We're always honored to have Jamie Lovegrove on with us. Hey, Jamie, how's the weather in South Carolina right now?
It's getting a little chilly. We're expecting, we've been braced for the possibility of some extremely rare snow on Sunday, which we do not. The forecast has increasingly warm, so it looks like it may turn into rain instead of snow, but some parts of the upstate may really get snow, so it's going to be an interesting weekend.
Yeah, and I wish I had more sympathy, but I'm in South Dakota, and it's been snowing all day and about 28 degrees, and tonight it's going to go down to 5 degrees. So just it'll harden the snow and whatever. But, and let me also ask you, and this is not a random weird question, although it sounds like it first, how's the noise level in South Carolina now? I asked about the weather, but is it noisy? Because you've got new laws. Charleston, South Carolina, lovely city, one of my favorite cities in the country that I've ever spent time in. Beautiful city. They recently have been dealing with noise. Have they not, Jamie? Is that true?
Yeah, well, so one of my former colleagues at the Post-and-Courier wrote a story last week about how Charleston in particular, but other cities also around South Carolina, seen an uptick in noise complaints over the last year or two. And, you know, I think there are a few factors that folks thought were playing into that. One is the fact that Charleston and several other cities in South Carolina are growing really fast. We're the 10th fastest growing state in the country. We have, you know, about 100 people moving per day to the Charleston area. And so, you know, that naturally means that there are going to be more possibilities for people to be making noise. But, you know, I think another factor that a lot of folks think is playing into this is the fact that, you know, so many more people have been working from home since the start of the pandemic. You know, including some that are now, you know, a lot of jobs have gone fully remote at this point, you know, with no plans to return, you know, even if the pandemic starts to recede. And so when you're at home all day, you maybe notice the dog barking next door or the, you know, loud teenagers playing music or whatever is in your neighborhood. So that has been an interesting challenge that they've been trying to come to address.
And by the way, Mark Frost is with us as a prog rock drummer, so he knows a thing or two about noise. But, you know, one of the things that's interesting is everybody knows the South. If I say to people, there's a phrase in the South, bless your heart, everybody knows what that means now. Around the country, they've learned that's the Southern way of saying F you, basically, correct? I mean, that's what that is, right? It's putting a nice face on something kind of mean. So in that sense, there's a slightly Southern Orwellian tinge to the fact that in Charleston now they have, Mark, have you heard in Charleston they have livability courts?
I didn't know that, but I've been to Charleston many times. Like you, it's one of my favorite cities. Speaking of noise,
yeah.
In North Georgia, fireworks are legal year-round. So you hear fireworks all the time.
Yeah. Now, what are the fireworks codes down? Because I know South Carolina, right on the border there was south of the border, where you could buy fireworks from Pepe, the cartoon Mexican. For a long time, anyone who drove to Florida from the north, you'd go by south of the border. Well, what are the fireworks laws like in South Carolina, and how often do you hear them, Jamie?
Yeah, it's actually Pedro, but close on the mascot.
Close enough. I don't want to get that wrong. Thanks for the correction.
But South Carolina does have some looser regulations around fireworks than some of our neighbor states. So, you know, right as you're crossing the border from North Carolina to South Carolina, there's a bunch of fireworks stores, you know, so that the North Carolina residents can make a quick trip across the border and grab those and go home. But, you know, it really depends on location. There are some, you know, barrier islands in South Carolina where fireworks are banned, and you will get in trouble for using them there. But there are certainly a lot of other places where we live up to our, you know, small government reputation, and place pretty light restrictions on that. So that may also be contributing to those noise complaints.
But explain. I'm not making up this livability course, right? That's a real thing. So explain that, then I'll throw it over to Mark.
The livability what, sorry?
The livability courts in Charleston. That's one of the things I read in this article, that they have livability courts now.
Yeah, so I think, it's a way to handle smaller disputes, and settle some of these issues that are not, serious, major, crimes, but are affecting the ways that people, just are annoyances, and trying to clear up those issues in sort of a separate venue.
Yeah, Mark?
Yeah, I just looked it up on the internet, and we do have them.
You have livability in
we have
Georgia?
livability courts here, too. Yeah, we have them, at least in Canton, and it looks like most of the far northern, either suburbs or just northern cities have them. One thing I liked about the South, I've been here about 2 years. I came here from Texas, is the South has a lot of the things I like about Texas, a little bit less attitude, but let's say I'm playing my drums at 11 o'clock at night. I mean, I'm sure there's some exceptions out there, but my experience being here is someone just comes over and knocks on your door and makes a reasoned argument with you, and then you tone it down, or I play the electrics with headphones or something. But most people talk to you first. That's been my experience here. So it's just friendlier than that. Whereas, say, in Austin, Texas, if you're playing your drums loud, the neighbor will never come over, knock on the door, and ask you to turn them down. They'll call the police. And so I don't know if that's cultural, if it's designed by government, but it is something I've noticed.
Now, Jimmy, what's your experience there?
I've not personally dealt with any of those problems, and I personally live in Columbia, where maybe we don't have, or at least in my neighborhood, we've not had too many of those issues. We do have the University of South Carolina here, so we have plenty of college kids, and those are, typically the types of folks who are creating a lot of the noise. We've been able to contain it relatively well here, and we're not growing quite as fast as Charleston is, so it's not too bad.
Now, speaking of a lot of noise, let's talk about Joe Biden's recent speech in Georgia about the Voting Rights Act. And I pointed out the next day that the speech was extremely overdramatic and bombastic. And he was saying stuff like, there become certain points that stop time. He literally said that. He talked about time stopping. Now, the Republican senator from South Carolina, you've got a couple. Lindsey Graham's one, the other one's Tim Scott. Tim Scott is, as many people know, is black. And Joe Biden was clearly, by evoking the Voting Rights Act and naming this after civil rights hero John Lewis, who served in Congress for many years. What was Tim Scott's reaction to Joe Biden's speech? Did he like it more than me? Lee said, knowing the answer already. Go ahead, Jamie. Talk about Tim Scott in this speech.
He was certainly not a fan of it. Tim Scott has, more credibility on this issue than a lot of other Republican elected officials do, because of the fact that he is a black man from the South. He is, a descendant of folks who really dealt with the real life experiences of Jim Crow in a much more direct way than many of his colleagues can attest to. And it's part of the reason why, it's been a priority of at least some members of the Republican Party, and certainly Tim Scott, to diversify their ranks, is to have more folks like him. He's the only black Republican in the Senate, one of the only black Republicans in all of Congress. There are a few folks who can speak with credibility and push back against references to to those historical wrongs and say that the comparisons are not appropriate. So no, he was certainly not a fan of it, and similarly to Mitch McConnell, called it divisive and argued that he is exaggerating the extent of the voting rights issues that exist today, certainly as they compare to what they were earlier in the 20th century.
In 1964, when the original Voting Rights Act was passed, for example, and saying this is a historic moment and everything else, it did, like I say, I use the word bombastic. Now, is what's been the history in South Carolina recently, for instance? A number of states, Texas, where you used to live, Mark, and Georgia, where you currently live, maybe it's an omen, Mark, maybe it's you, where Republicans are like, where can we pass more voting rights laws? Oh, I know, let's look where Mark Frost is living. Maybe that's what they're doing, because Texas and Georgia are brought up as two of the states that did this, and you happen to have lived there in order.
So I'm the causal variable.
I think you are, Mark. That's what I'm suggesting. But, Jamie, what did South Carolina change voting at all in the wake of the 2020 election? And have they passed anything recently that Democrats would say is restrictive? Often what they mean by restrictive is, for instance, they change the early voting period from 6 weeks to 5 weeks or something like that. And technically it's more restrictive, but it's not exactly the 1964 Voting Rights Act. It's not exactly Jim Crow. That's the argument I would make. But Jimmy, what's been South Carolina's history recently of changing voting laws?
So it certainly has not been as, they have not taken as significant action as it have. And, I imagine that part of the reason for that is that, it's just not as competitive here. Republicans are much less out losing their vice grip on control of South Carolina government. They're much less worried about losing statewide elections than, Republicans in Georgia, Republicans in Iowa, Republicans in states that have passed more, and even Texas, states that have passed more election bills. What they have tried to do in the wake of the 2020 election is consolidate more power at the state level as opposed to the county level. Historically, counties are, pretty autonomous in how they get to oversee their own elections in South Carolina. There are certain standards. They, have some independence on how they do it, and Republicans in the state house have tried to create more uniformity and more standardization statewide, that has the folks that have actually been complaining about that, not surprisingly, is actually less Democrats per se. It's less partisan than it is the county election officials who say, that one size doesn't fit all, and a big county like Charleston, needs to operate their elections a little differently than a small county like Barnwell County in the western part of the state. So we've seen some of that. I've seen, them take more control and put it in the hands of legislators as opposed to the state election commission. New appointees to the state election commission confirmed by the state Senate. That was a change that they made. So it would give for Republicans in the legislature over who is in control of elections. But, in terms of significant changes to the actual voting process, we've not really seen that here as much. There were obviously a few changes in 2020 because of the pandemic. Those will likely get those were temporary at the time, and those will likely not get reinstated. That has been something Democrats have complained about. The election here was pretty successful. We seemed to go off without a hitch, and these extra early voting times, these extra absentee ballot options did not seem to impinge on voter integrity. the Democrats say, let's just make those changes permanent. But the Republicans have not been swayed by that argument.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
Yeah, Mark, go ahead. Did you have a question for Jamie?
Yeah, he just kind of triggered my mind, because it seems to me there's sort of two Americas. There's the America that argues we're a republic and too much democracy is a bad thing. We don't really want a democracy. The country was formed and engineered as a republic, and therefore states' rights matter, even county rights matter, and even municipal rights matter. And I went to a party last night and made new friends with a journalist, Jamie. So, and I found it fascinating, us just kind of comparing, attitudes and brains on just the issues. And so what is your view on that? What is your feel from just your reporting and then working with people? Do people believe, just from an ideological perspective, that more democracy is necessarily better?
That's an interesting question. I think, like a lot of other states, Democrats, or a lot of other historically red states, there are Democratic officials who believe that if they were able to get more people to vote, that they would have a better chance of winning, as in they basically believe that most non-voters are more likely to vote for Democrats than they are for Republicans. And so they want to make it as easy to vote as possible, and in fact sort of offer ways that encourage folks to vote. But my sense is that I think we have a pretty well-functioning democracy in South Carolina, and I think that most people seem to think that things are going okay here, and don't see the need for any sort of major changes. And I imagine there are probably some folks who think that giving too much power to voters, sort of direct democracy, is not a direction we would want to go in.
Now, Jimmy, let me ask. We hinted at it a little bit, but what's been the COVID situation with the Omicron variant? And what's been people's reaction to it? What I assume is that South Carolina is like every place else, which is the number of cases have gone up, but the severity of cases does not seem to be higher. Have you had any hospitals filling up or anything like that? And do you think people are a little more cynical about the COVID-19 narrative in general? Have there been any changes at a government level down there in South Carolina? What's going on with South Carolina and COVID, Jimmy Lovegrove?
It's not great in terms of the cases. We do have now one of the, I believe, actually the fastest growing case rates in the entire country over the last 2 weeks. And I've just today had about 20,000 new cases, which far, far, far breaks the daily record in South Carolina. So we are, at sort of by far the peak of the pandemic. But you are right that we are not having quite as many deaths, and the hospitalizations are still happening, but not, commensurate to that level of new cases. We are certainly hearing pretty consistently from hospital officials in South Carolina that close to 100%, if not like 99.9% of ICU COVID patients are unvaccinated. And so they have continued to really implore people to make that choice. But you're right that, it's these extremely, extremely high case rates, way, way higher than any other point in the pandemic for us. We have not, seen a really dramatic surge of deaths. Certainly the governor and other elected officials have been very clear that there is no level of cases at this point that would tell them to those new restrictions. They are very much past the point of doing that, and have said that, it's really a matter of personal responsibility at this point.
Now, as we head into 2022, obviously every 2 years, every House of Representative members up for election. But do you have any other big elections, gubernatorial or otherwise, and senatorial in South Carolina this year?
Yeah, we do. I don't imagine that they're going to be especially close, but we do have a governor's race. Henry Master, who replaced Nikki Haley. He was lieutenant governor when Nikki Haley went to become U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations in 2017. He became governor. He won his first 4-year term in 2018, and now he's running for re-election. You know, if he wins, he would actually become he will be on the way to becoming the longest-serving governor in South Carolina history because, you know, normally you have a 2-term limit, but because he got those extra 2 years at the beginning before having to run for his first election, he would end up getting 10 years in office, which would be a new record in South Carolina. He has no serious Republican primary challengers, which it's been viewed as a real big victory on his part because, you know, as recently as a year ago, it was looking quite likely that he would have some serious threats from the right. So he looks like he's going to have a clear path to the party's nomination. He will then face one of 2 Democrats, 2 pretty strong Democratic challengers compared to previous cycles. One of them is Joe Cunningham, a former congressman, and another is Nia McLeod, who's a state senator. They're competing for the Democratic nomination. Whichever one of them wins will be a fairly formidable Democratic candidate, but, you know, the fact of the matter is in South Carolina that doesn't really matter because no matter how you know, well of a campaign the Democrat runs, it has not turned out any different for them over the last several years. So there will be that race, and then also Tim Scott is up for re-election, but he is widely expected to cruise to another 6-year term there. So, you know, the most exciting election in South Carolina this year is most likely to be a congressional race. Tom Rice, who was one of the 10 Republicans who voted to impeach President Trump after January 6th, faces 10 Republican primary challengers.
Wow.
That vote. And, you know, he's running, and it's going to be an interesting race. You know, he does certainly still have some support, but there's no question that a lot of Trump supporters were very angry at him for that vote, and it may cost him his seat.
Well, the final question, Jamie, and it sort of relates to both of them. You've seen a lot of new people come to South Carolina. That's correct, right?
That is right.
Now, where does anyone know where they're coming from, and they've not affected the political aspirations of the Democrats, have they? Because I think a lot of people, their concern is if they're in a red state, let's say, that people from blue states like California, for instance, leaving California in droves. Right now, it's very hard to get a U-Haul going from Texas to California, they're saying, for example. This might change the political makeup of places, but you're not seeing any new arrivals in South Carolina that seem like they're going to affect the political makeup of South Carolina anytime soon, correct?
You know, so far, you know, we have seen some of those, you know, sort of more liberal voters moving from states like California, states like New York, but they're kind of canceled out by the fact that we also have a lot of retirees moving from, you know, states like Ohio or states like Indiana. And, you know, of course, retirees, older voters tend to be more conservative. So if anything, you know, those two sort of factors have kind of canceled each other out. And, you know, we have not seen a really significant shift despite the fact that the population, you know, is growing so quickly.
Well, Jamie, we're out of time. Fantastic appearance as usual, Jamie Lovegrove. Jamie, tell people real quickly where they can find your work.
The best place is just to follow me on Twitter at JSLovegrove.
JS Lovegrove. Thanks so much, Jamie. Great appearance. We got more coming up with our guest host on Frosty Friday, Mark Frost. That worked out. More with Mark right after this on The Backstory.
listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
And we are back. It is time for the last hour of the week before a 3-day weekend, because Martin Luther King Day on Monday we will not be on, of the best damn talk show in the world. I'm Lee Stranahan, along with my guest co-host Mark Frost on Frosty Friday on The Backstory. So there we go, Mark. You see Jamie Lovegrove, pretty smart cookie, right? Clearly knows quite a bit about South Carolina politics. Yep. And always very interesting, because South Carolina is one of those states that seems to show up because of the importance of Lindsey Graham. He's one of the most influential longtime Republican senators. And as he points out, Tim Scott, the only black Republican senator out there, and one who does take issues. You know, the Democrats have tried very hard to make race a central issue for them, and Tim Scott's made that difficult. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, what I found interesting was he said there was 10 Republican challengers in the legislative race.
Well,
which I thought was fascinating.
It's chum in the water. When someone sees somebody go after someone like Trump, they sense there could be an opening to get Trump voters, which are a large percentage. We'll talk about that a little bit, of the Republican base right now. And coming up this hour, Elbert Guillory from Louisiana, who's going to be running for lieutenant governor. Always love having Elbert on the show. That's all this hour on The Backstory. Now, I want to talk, I mentioned Daniel McAdams in the last hour. Daniel McAdams co-hosts the Ron Paul Liberty Report show every day. And he's the executive director, or the director, I forget which one. He's the director of the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity. And last time he was on, I asked Daniel, I said, do you think the libertarians, this is their time? And Daniel said something interesting that actually one of Rand Paul's top political aides had said to me too. It seems like, and I know, Mark, you were a recovering libertarian in some ways, but I'm going to make an argument that I really believe. I think a lot of libertarians, what this Rand Paul associate told me, and what Daniel McAdams said on the show, is a lot of people who were used to call themselves libertarians shy away from that label. They don't like using terms like libertarian anymore. I'm going to argue, Mark, I think that's a mistake. I personally, my sense of the electorate is people want something new. And even though libertarianism is not new, ask Lysander Spooner about that. Even though libertarianism is not new, it's like, I'll make an analogy to homeschooling. I've been homeschooling as a parent for, Shane, my son, who's no longer co-hosting Ball Lines. But Shane was homeschooled his entire life. He's going to turn 30 this year. So he went to kindergarten. I think he went to first grade a little bit, but very quickly we took him out of school. So a lot of people, when I see them talk about homeschooling, they act like it's something new, and they're just talking about issues like socialization and stuff. But to me, it's been around forever. And I've been talking about and dealing with homeschooling for decades. And so does with libertarianism. NBC used to, I think for a lot of people, it seems new. And I'd say if there's ever a time not to shy away from the name, but because to present it as an here's what I think. I think the average voter is sick of Democrats and Republicans, both of them. And if you present something new, I'll put it like this. Bernie Sanders learned this lesson. Democratic socialism ain't new. They were talking about in Russia in the 1880s. There were these democratic socialist organizations who killed Tsar Alexander II, for instance. They assassinated him. Those were democratic socialists who did that. Anyone can look that up.
Yeah.
So Bernie Sanders has microwave democratic socialism, and a lot of people went, oh, what's this new thing? It's not new at all. So do you get the sense that people would be more open to someone saying, I'm this thing called a libertarian, and on issues like the economy, and particularly against the Fed? Because I think a lot of people are very skeptical of the Fed at this point, and the way our economy runs, which is not capitalism, as you know. A lot of people on the left like to say all of our economy's problems are because it's capitalist. And you and I sort of scratch our heads in bafflement because we look at the economy and this ain't capitalism, right?
No, it actually more resembles fascism.
Yeah, now explain that to people.
Sure. First of all, let me just make sure that people on the libertarian side, I'm a giant fan of Ron Paul. I bet I have sold at least 1,000 of his End the Fed books. Every time I teach money in banking or financial derivatives or any kind of monetary course, I require In the Fed by Ron Paul. So I'm a giant Ron Paul fan. If him and I were together and we were talking influences, we would share a significant number of influences. And as an ideology, I struggle to find a movement more influential than libertarians as an ideology. As a political movement, we have been absolutely horrible. And I'll tell you why. There's two kinds of libertarians. There's libertarians that believe that you need government, but you need to minimize it, and you need to have institutions that control its scope creep. And then you have what the Austrian school of libertarianism, which is anarcho-capitalism, that the smallest majority is the individual. Individuals should be sovereign. The ultimate expression of freedom would be to be a sovereign individual, and there shouldn't be any government at all from a public forced coercive position. If you don't like the laws where you're living, go somewhere else and start your own government, et cetera, and people can vote with their feet. So my problem, so when we get to the ideological part of libertarianism, I am a libertarian. I am an ideological libertarian. When you get to the political aspirations of it, it loses its force because we libertarians get nervous if we get too many members, because we bicker amongst ourselves more than we bicker with socialists or communists or things like that. And so, for instance, a great example was 2020 when the cities were burning and looting going on left and right. The libertarian candidate endorsed Black Lives Matter. I had planned on voting for Joe Biden. Because as you know, I was never a big Trump fan, ever. And then all of a sudden I see this absolute collapse of property rights, of the rule of law, and this endorsement by business, by entrepreneurs, by all sorts of people of this quasi-post-communist organization. And it infuriated me. And so not only did I not vote for Joe Jorgensen, I voted for Donald Trump. And so that's the problem I think that libertarians have as a political movement. The membership of libertarians is actually quite diverse, and you do have those two major schools that are involved there.
Well, and part of the problem...
No, that's fine. Go ahead.
As I think I mentioned to you, I went to an objectivist high school, a high school started by fans of Ayn Rand when I was 17 in White Plains, New York.
She hated libertarians. She hated them with a passion.
She did, but one of my teachers, my math teacher, Herb Grossman there, he was the one who actually taught Ayn Rand algebra and trigonometry when she was in her 80s. He was her tutor.
Oh, really?
My math teacher was her tutor, yes. And he was around for NBI, Nathaniel Branden Institute. And he described it to me once as a herd of mavericks. And
that's a good way to put it. I like that. I would also describe objectivism as that way, too.
It is. It's a lot of people who pride themselves on being individuals, yet they're all smoking out of, cigarette holders and wearing capes in the 60s, because Ayn Rand did.
And having dollar signs on their on
their brooches.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
And the Libertarian Party's got some of that problem too. It's people who, in one sense, people sometimes describe politics as herding cats, and you're a cat owner, so you know how difficult that can be. And when you've got people who are individualistic, they are harder to organize than people, and the Democrats have succeeded because the Democratic base, in a lot of ways, eschews individualism, particularly the modern Democratic base.
Yes, they do.
And
it's all groupthink.
It's exactly right. It's all groupthink, and they argue against individuality. In fact, quite explicitly sometimes. And that's
I think you're onto something there. I think you're right on.
Well, but I still think that libertarianism is as libertarianism does. In other words, there would be no one just, if someone stated, I'm a libertarian, and they did it their way, which was not the anarcho-capitalism, not supporting Black Lives Matter, they wouldn't get kicked out of the Libertarian Party for doing that. In fact, I think it hurt Jo Jorgensen that she supported Black Lives Matter. Do you think it hurt her among libertarians writ large? I do.
I do. Absolutely, I do. Because even just from looking at it on Twitter, which is not a good scientific measure, but just anecdotally among my friends, looking at what people write back and forth, and I'm not talking about Twitter, I'm talking about just in the academic libertarian world. So she was seen as someone who was endorsing, even if you wouldn't have had the violence, BLM traces its roots back to, at best, a postmodernist, and at worst, a post-communist ideology. And that's, generally speaking, if you ask most libertarians, what's the worst ism that's ever been invented, I would venture to say libertarians, by and large, would answer communism. The most horrible thing that can be conceived in terms of any form of human organization. And so I think it hurt her really bad. She was given an opportunity to kind of soften it back and pedal back a little bit. She doubled down, and there was a mass sucking sound of votes out from under her. And she got the libertarian feminists. She definitely got them, and she got what you might call the libertarian influenced Democrats, who didn't like, for which Joe Biden left a bad taste in their mouth. But she lost the rank and file of libertarians, and I suspect, I don't have any scientific polling proof of this, but I highly suspect a lot of those voters either didn't vote, which is not all that un-libertarian, by the way. That's another problem with libertarians. They're the least likely to vote. But I suspect the ones that were lost from Jo Jorgensen either didn't vote or they voted for Trump, by and large.
Now, speaking, you mentioned Donald Trump. Let's talk about him in the 2020 election. If someone just asked you in a poll, so I'll do it. I'm taking a poll of one, a poll of you, Mark Frost. If I ask you whether
let the hate mail begin.
Well, no, let's see. By the way, we've got a great audience, 202-521-1320, if anyone wants to call in. But, Mark Frost, do you consider the 2020 election was fair? However you define that, do you consider that a fair election?
Okay, I'll answer that, but I am going to make some assumptions on your words, because to a guy like me, I value reason and logic, you know, those libertarian John Locke values, and it means something. So words mean something. I'd rather say it like this. Do I view the 2020 election as legal? Yes, because states, whether I like it or not, constitutionally, states get wide authority in how they run their elections. There are some national limitations, but there's not that many. So I'm going to argue that the election was legal, that it wasn't fraudulent. I haven't consumed any evidence that the election was fraudulent. But you used the word fair, and that is such an open-ended, just wide open question, because is it fair that a pro-Biden state like California would just open up its absentee ballots and say, anybody that wants to vote can vote, we don't even require ID? Well, it's probably not fair, being that you just changed the rules on the dime, and people were preparing for an election based on rules they thought they were going to be playing up with, and then the rules got changed just sort of out of the blue. Well, that's not fair, but it's legal. And it's one of the things we were talking about earlier, that federalist nature of our Constitution versus democracy, if you will. I personally don't advocate democracy. I don't like democracy. In fact, I would argue that states that are not democratic, like the old Soviet Union, the worst thing you can do to them is give them unbridled democracy. It isn't going to be sustainable. They don't have the cultural foundation to manage that yet. Much better would be some sort of a federalist system. And so, yes, I think that the election was legal. I don't think it was fraudulent. I think Biden won by the constitutional rules of the game, but I also think the states were not interested in fairness. They were wanting to get their guy elected, and they did so by bending the rules in a legal way.
Well, one of the arguments that, yeah, no, it sure does. It's a great answer. It's one of the arguments I've made is it's not fair, just in the sense that the elements of the intelligence community working with social media literally censored the Joe Biden and discredited the Hunter Biden laptop story right before the election. And that, to me, when you've got the government working with media to bury a story and discredit a story that's true right before the election en masse, I don't see how that can be called fair. It's just not fair to me. That's.
But I see where you're coming from, but that's not a governmental. See, from a libertarian perspective, Twitter can do what they want. Now, the retort to that is, well, is Twitter behaving truly as a private business, or are they a private business doing the bidding of an administration?
Well, that's a good question.
A particular candidate.
On the Hunter Biden laptop story, you got to remember, the intelligence community came out. Elements of the government came out and said, this is Russian disinformation. So there was an official government statement from people connected to the government saying that that story was Russian disinformation. It was nothing of the kind. Let me tie that in to one of the big headlines as we go into this afternoon's show. You know, you talked about whether people who've been under, let's say, a dictatorship can handle democracy, and you said, I think they almost can't handle it, right? That's your view, that they're not equipped to handle it in a lot of ways, correct? I'm not putting words in your mouth.
Not only are they not equipped, but the institutions of the society aren't equipped for it either.
Okay, so I'm going to argue that so we are right now, because the New York Times came out with a story that said the U.S. government, now don't forget, we're currently supposedly in negotiations with Russia over a serious issue that's been compared to the Cuban Missile Crisis, because the U.S. is putting missiles right at Russia's doorstep, right in their backyard in Ukraine. sending Javelin missiles over there. And in the middle of those negotiations,
always.
Yes, and in the middle of negotiations, I would say not a great negotiation tactic. The U.S. has come out, and it was front page breaking news in the New York Times, that the U.S. is saying Russia is planting a false flag so they can attack Ukraine. Now, I read that story, and what I noticed was the Times is running this story as breaking news, even though they admit in paragraph, I think 3, there's no proof at all. In other words, even the people making the claim, the U.S. government, has offered no proof of this. And the Times admits that. Now, any rational person would go, wait a second. So there's no proof of this. And it's not like they told you the proof secretly, New York Times. You're admitting you've seen no proof. Then why are you reporting it? Right? That seems to me like a logical question, which is,
sure,
if they don't have proof of something, why report it? And the answer is, you watch. Nobody's going to criticize the New York Times for reporting something without any proof, because the standards for what constitutes journalism have so slipped. And I would argue the Hunter Biden laptop story, I still don't hear people talking about that as much as they should be. The fact that elements of the government, you see what I'm saying? That no one's talking about it.
I totally agree on that one, yes.
And it's a really big deal. And by the way, yeah, go ahead, Mark.
Oh, I was just going to say, personally, my favorite economist, Joseph Schumpeter, wrote a book in 1943. It's a classic. Everybody ought to read it. It's called Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy. And he argues that socialism is the natural evolution as a society moves to pure democracy. The more democratic you get, the more socialist you get. And the Lockean, or the counter argument for that, is, are there things that the public demands that should not be allowed to the public majority? What if by vast majority vote, anybody with the last name Stranahan gets put in a concentration camp without any due process of law or anything? Should the public, even though they vote for it, and it's demanded by the public, say 95% of the public wants that to happen, is that something that the public has a right to just because they democratically demand it? And so Schumpeter has his famous quote of, if democracy merely means majority rule, what could be more democratic than a lynching? And that's the question we have to face in this country, because it seems to me everybody seems to want more democracy without looking at the costs of more democracy. And there are costs. And so I would recommend everybody read that book. It's prescient to this right to today. He argues that the true pacemakers of socialism are not the Marxists and the social agitators. It's the press. It's the media. And he wrote that in 1943.
Yeah, no,
because
and
the media is either going to be fair or they're not going to be fair. And if they're not going to be fair, then one of the most important private institutions in the entire country, people don't have faith in anymore, and that's the media. I myself learned about your show. I learned about Sputnik and fault lines back when you were hosting that. I learned about it because I was embarrassed. For some reason, I tuned into the show one day, and I heard about it on something. Somehow it crossed my radar, and there was this thing on Syria. And I'm like, okay, what they're saying must be insane. Basically, you had a guest on saying that we're allied with Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, and that sounded insane to me. And my rationale was, if that was happening, that would be in the New York Times. That would be here. That would be in the Washington Post. It would be all over the news. It'd be on CNN. So I started researching it. I made some calls to people I know that do business in that part of the world, say, oh, yeah, that's right. That's 100% true. And I felt stupid. I mean, I'm a highly educated person, and I was I was deluded as to what was actually going on, and I didn't like the fact that my government was playing the role that it was playing in that affair. And right then and there, I realized, okay, just because the media is not reporting it doesn't mean it's true, and just because what they're reporting, that doesn't make it true. So that's kind of my view on that.
No, and imagine my, by the way, Sharif, we'll get you in one sec. Imagine my shock when I went over to Lebanon in 2013, and it wasn't hard. You just asked people, and again, it's not difficult to figure this stuff out, but the media's job is to bury it. Let me also just mention before we go to Sharif, real quickly, that the reason I use the term fair is that's the exact phrase that South Dakota Republican Senator Mike Rounds used to describe the election on George Stephanopoulos this past Sunday. He said the 2020 election was fair. That's his word. And that's why I use that, by the way, because if someone asked me if the votes were correct or incorrect, I have no way of speaking to that. But I wouldn't use the word fair at all to describe it. That's my take on that. And that's why I use that word. 202-521-1320. Sharif, thanks for holding. What is on your mind today?
Thanks for taking my call, gentlemen. I'd like to say free journal and science. I'm glad you got Mike Frost on today. He's going to explain this better than me. Okay, I got two comments. The first comment, Russia, the way the Russia's going to respond to the U.S. is by putting their troops in Cuba and Venezuela, especially putting them new Tu-160s, Tu-160Ms in those countries as well with the Zyklon missiles, was going to give the U.S. headaches. The second comment is dealing with the Turkish lira. I found out yesterday why it's doing so. I mean, it's doing bad in that they got European banks that's invested heavy into Turkey, into the lira and things like that. As the Turkey is getting worse, is going to bring down those banks in Europe, which is going to have a chain effect that's going to come over and hurt us too, which is not a good thing. And I also heard that our interest rates are going to climb up to 15 to 20% by summer of this year. But the news reports, they're going to come out and lie and say that it's only 5 or 7%, but it's going to be at 20%. That's all I want to say. Thank you for taking my call.
Oh, thanks, Sharif. Now, Mark, do you know anything about the Turkish lira? Because if anyone would, it'd be you.
Yes, I do. And I'm glad he brought up the question, because it shows we have citizens that think about things that matter. Because Turkey actually is a very important international player, if only because of their geography, and they are a conduit of goods and services between Asia and Europe, Middle East, that sort of a thing. And if we had Prime Minister, if we had the Prime Minister on right now, he would probably be saying, okay, Turkey's currency problems are because of foreign interference. We have all these day traders, and we have all these institutional people that are putting pressure on our currency. And he's right, because right now investors are voting with their pocketbook, and they're betting on the fact that the lira is going to fall in value to other world currencies. And they're doing that because the Turkish government is printing money, just like every government out there right now, except they're printing money at a faster rate than most of its contemporaries are. And that's the problem that they have right now, is they're not in a crisis yet, but they have severe pressure being put on the lira, because if the market drops for the lira, everything they import becomes instantly more expensive. And the political situation there is precarious anyway. And so it's not uncommon when you see monetary crashes like happened in Indonesia in 1998, that you have a corresponding and very quick revolution going on and riots and that sort of a thing. And so that's what people are worried about in Turkey, because of some bad monetary decisions. Institutional players are putting even more pressure on the country's currency now, basically they're betting against it in the futures market, and that puts political pressure on the government as the poor people who have to buy cooking oil, have to buy rice, have to buy food, and suddenly anything that's imported is more expensive, drastically more expensive, while even domestic purchases still are more expensive because the purchasing power of the lira is down.
And that right there is why we have Frosty Fridays, because fantastic answer from Mark Frost. We got to go to a break. When we come back, Albert Guillory will be joining us from Louisiana. He'll be running for lieutenant governor, I'm led to understand. We'll be talking to Albert about that, right? And we'll be talking about this Biden speech and a variety of other things right after this on The Backstory.
Stuck in traffic? No problem. Stay informed. Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik on 105.5 FM or 1390 AM in the Washington, D.C. area. Need more? Follow us on Facebook or check us out on SputnikNews.com.
When the going gets tough, the powerful want propaganda. But we won't let them cancel the facts. Whether you're woke or drowsy, we know that you can handle the truth, and we're giving it to you every morning. Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan every Monday through Friday from 7 to 10 a.m. Eastern. Your first stop for sanity in a world gone mad.
In a media landscape filled with so-called journalists acting as stenographers for their billionaire bosses, there is a desperate need for news, analysis, and perspectives that buck the status quo and get to the heart of how domestic and international events impact you and me, as well as showing how we can get involved in the struggle to change that status quo. Check out By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik, Monday through Friday from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, to hear the stories and voices that mainstream media refuses to tell you. And join us as we connect the political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us. That's By Any Means Necessary, Monday through Friday at 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, right here on Radio Sputnik.
Hi, I'm political analyst Garland Nixon.
And I'm political scientist, author, and nationally syndicated columnist Dr. Wilmer Leon.
We're the co-hosts for The Critical Hour, airing Monday through Friday from 6 to 8 p.m. Eastern Time here on Radio Sputnik in Washington, D.C.
We close out your day with a thorough and hard-hitting analysis of the day's top stories, where we bring in brilliant scholars, authors, and investigative journalists from around the world.
And on Fridays, it's panel time, when we do a roundup of the week's most important issues.
Join us to keep up with the world's top stories.
Enjoy an in-depth analysis.
And have a little fun along the way. Listen to our show,
The Critical Hour, Monday through Fridays on Radio Sputnik.
And we are back, 105.5 FM, AM 1390 in Washington, D.C., and the surrounding environs. If I'm using that word correctly or even pronouncing it close to correctly, I'm not sure. I like to use words I don't know how to pronounce sometimes, Mark, I'll be honest with you. But great show. It is Frosty Fridays, and Mark Frost is joining us as our guest host. And it's the last show before the 3-day weekend, because we have every federal holiday off here at Sputnik. That doesn't mean it'll be static if you turn over. No, it just means there's no original content. None of the shows tape on federal holidays, and it's Martin Luther King Day on Monday. But joining us right now from the great state of Louisiana, my friend, a guy I admire quite a bit, Albert Guillory. Hey, Albert, how you doing?
Doing very well. How are you today?
I'm good, although it's snowy and cold, and it's going to be 5 degrees tonight in South Dakota. So we got that happening.
I'm sorry to hear that. It is about 65 and sunny and beautiful in Louisiana today.
I'll tell you one thing, though, what we don't have aside from... Now, by the way, Mardi Gras is coming up, right? I heard that Mardi Gras, they're going to require vaccination statements or something. Is that what's going on?
Well, Mardi Gras is a part of the Southwest Louisiana culture, not just New Orleans. In New Orleans, there will be some very severe requirements But in places like Mamou and Lafayette and Opelousas, Tunis, there will not be those. People will just go about their lives as normal. We're a little careful. Many people have gotten vaccinated. We are washing our hands. Some people wear masks, particularly those who have underlying conditions. But it's a common sense world and a common sense time, and we are not going to run scared and hide because there's a bug out there.
No, that's what I saw, is that in New Orleans, they're going to be requiring masks at Mardi Gras, right? That's what, because I remember now, because I came up with a joke, which is there will be guys throwing beads and shouting to women who are strangers, show us your chins. You see what I'm saying? And so I'm just, that'll be the new thing to show people at Mardi Gras. It's not like that every year, but Albert, by the way, Mark, have you met Albert before?
I have not. My honor.
Albert, Mark Albert. There you go. There's the introduction.
Mark, it's a pleasure to meet you.
It is my pleasure, and I love what you just said. To me, that encapsulates the American spirit. We have a problem. We want to have common sense. We want to be pragmatic, but we don't want to live in fear and throw away our culture and our ability to enjoy life.
Well, no, and that's why Albert is so great. Now, Albert was in the civil rights movement because, you know, he grew up in Louisiana, so he had to deal with some issues. You couldn't, if I remember correctly, Albert, when you were growing up, you couldn't, because you're black, you could not get books out of the local library, correct?
That's correct. So when I was 15, I went into the library, demanded that I get a book, and was arrested at my first arrest at the age of 15. Of course, I was from Southern University when I was 18 for some writings. I was a newspaper editor there, and I wrote things that were illegal, like if I pay America's taxes and I fight America's wars, America will not force me to walk around the back door of the courthouse. So and
that was something you had to do at that time as well?
Absolutely.
Yes, and then Albert
Lee,
became Yeah, Mark, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, since you and I are drummers, I've done a lot of studio work in and around New Orleans, and talking to the old timers. If you like jazz like I do, I mean, you love jazz and you play it, and you go play with people, I mean, you're going to meet a lot of African American musicians, and the stories that I've heard, it doesn't seem to be like that now. I haven't noticed it just from my own life there, playing there. But the old timers tell me exactly that there was a different door you had to go through. So you'd play at the club, but you'd enter through the black. But the guitarist who was black would have to, come in through the back door, not through the front door, and stuff like that, which was weird because they were going to see black musicians. But still, so I can testify just to the oral history that a lot of that went on.
Absolutely. That is the story of my growing up in the 1950s and 60s. Of course, I started growing up in the 1940s. So that was the way it was. We have come a long way. America was not perfect then. It's not perfect yet, but it's a hell of a lot closer to being perfect now.
Yes, and that's why Albert became the first Republican who was in the Louisiana Senate since Reconstruction, when he switched from the Democratic to the Republican Party a few years ago, an event that I happened to be at down, I believe it was in Baton Rouge, right, Albert, where you announced you were becoming a Republican. That event, I believe, was in Baton Rouge, correct?
It was.
It's been years. It's been years, and I've since been in jail myself in Baton Rouge after I was arrested during the Alton Sterling. I was one of 5 reporters who was arrested there, and I served time in the parish prison. Because when they put you, you know this. See, Albert, when I told people I was in parish prison, they said, no, you were in jail. And I said, no. I was in prison. And does that make sense to you that I would have been, that they would have put some people in the parish prison there?
Yes, that is exactly what it is called. It is the parish prison. You were not in a city jail. You were in a parish prison or a state prison. That's where you were.
That's right. And I was with people who committed murder and stuff like that, who I had very interesting conversations with. By the way, all the people who committed murder in there that I spoke to are innocent, Albert. I know that may shock you. But everyone told me, you know, they were in on a bum rap. Or they were guilty, but she had it coming. In one case, he did admit to doing it, but it was her fault. This guy stabbed his wife to death. But Albert's an attorney now, and I also heard, Albert, the reason I'm giving your bio, you're about to run for lieutenant governor, I hear. Is that correct?
That is correct. Last night, I announced before the regional meeting of the Louisiana Federation of Republican Women, I made my announcement. I am a candidate for lieutenant governor.
Now, so this is fantastic that we're very honored, especially to have you. But let me ask you a real basic question. What the hell does a lieutenant governor do? Because I've heard that phrase. I know what a governor does, but Mark's thought was that the lieutenant governor sits around and waits for the governor to die or something like that. But what I assume there's more to this.
Guess.
That was Mark's guess. But what does the lieutenant governor do in Louisiana, Albert?
In Louisiana, the lieutenant governor has responsibility for tourism and for keeping Louisiana clean. That's by constitution. However, by training, because of my I've been in politics and law 54 years. Because of my experience in law, politics, and government, particularly the Louisiana government, the Louisiana legislature, having spent a decade in the legislature, I will be very, very actively involved in setting policies and passing laws for the great state of Louisiana.
Now, I take it that the election's going to be in November, correct? You have to go through a primary process, or what's the road forward on your? Because we know you're going to win, of course, you'll prevail. But what's the road forward for Albert Guillory on his road to lieutenant gubernatorial status?
Actually, I have about 20 months before the election, before that primary. It will be in November of next year. So I'm getting out early. I have a lot of miles to cover, a lot of places to visit, hands to shake before that election comes. I want people to know me, to know what it is that they will get.
And what will they get? I got my own. I think you are, as Mark's already seen, you're a very positive person with real life experience and a proud citizen of Louisiana who's seen Louisiana change a great deal. And I think your positivity and your eloquence are part of what would make you a great spokesman, being in charge of Louisiana tourism. Also, your gator dust. Because we've talked before. The other thing you should know about Albert, by the way, Mark, is Albert's a chef. And so if we ask him for, yes. And so whenever foods come up, he's always got something to say. But Albert, what's your short stump speech? Why should people elect Albert Guillory lieutenant governor?
Well, we have a lot of problems right now in Louisiana. Our roads and bridges are crumbling. Too many people are out of work. Our public education system is failing our children. Violence racks our cities, and our citizens are not safe even in their own homes. So because government and politics are failing us, someone with knowledge and experience and wisdom, because I'm not a spring chicken, still energetic and young enough to protect, to fight, to defend what is good. And I have solutions, tried and true solutions. So I'm able to help lead Louisiana to better solutions than we have today.
Now, I thought Joe Biden was going to fix all of the infrastructure. One of the things they just announced. So you're not putting your faith in Joe Biden to fix everything and make it all better, Albert? Is that what I'm hearing?
Excuse me while I get up off the floor. I just fell off my... No, we have to come up with some much better and more common sense solutions. I'll give you an example. Louisiana is an oil and gas state. To get rid of the oil and gas industry, which will also get rid of the chemical plants in Louisiana, would put us back into the Stone Ages. We would destroy the economy of Louisiana, and we have nothing to replace that with. Many hundreds of thousands of families would no longer be employed and housed and clothed and sent to school. So we have to proceed with an eye toward tomorrow, but also with an eye toward today. We can't just destroy all of our economies in the hopes that we can stop hurricanes from coming to Louisiana in the future. We still have to feed our people and clothe our people today. So just bringing common sense and the experience and wisdom of having lived almost 80 years, bringing that to government is a breath of fresh air. Can you imagine that? An 80-year-old breath of fresh air.
Yes, who still can speak coherently, unlike our current president. Go ahead, Mark.
Oh, I was just going to say I love that. I wished I lived in Louisiana, and I'd vote for you. I'll send you a donation. How's that? I'll track you down on the internet, and at least I can help you, because as an economist, I study the impact of policy on people. And let's just take them down the list. Inflation. Who does it really hurt? It hurts the working people. It hurts regular people. Violence and crime. Who does it hurt? It hurts the regular people. If you're very, very wealthy, it doesn't hurt you. First of all, you live in a different part of town. You got your own private security, that sort of a thing. And then you have climate change. Nobody's saying we shouldn't think about it. Nobody's saying we shouldn't do something about it. But there's a rule in economics that you don't abate a bad thing beyond its marginal cost. Else, that's irrational. And who does over-abatement of climate change hurt? And, Albert is exactly right. If you destroy the oil and gas business, it isn't just that business that you're going to destroy. There's an amplifier impact, and it destroys all of the service businesses that service that. So when you actually compute the total cost of that self-sabotage, it's insane, and it values his message of common sense from my level of expertise on this.
Albert, what say you, sir?
We are absolutely on the same page. It makes absolutely no sense to... there were people who were caught in the hurricane in New Orleans. It took them 9 hours to take what would normally be a 3-hour trip to Acadiana. It took them 9 hours. The people who had electric cars, because they couldn't get, there were no stations around for them to get plugged into. We have to take steps gradually. We cannot just throw out an industry and try to replace it overnight without the infrastructure that goes with it and all of the support that goes with it. It's just that's a nutty idea. We have to be careful with an eye toward tomorrow, but still we must take care of today.
Now, Albert, tell people we might as well get this out of the way now, since Mark mentioned wanting to help you out. If people want to help you out, if they want to go to your campaign website, maybe make a donation, where would they go, Albert Guillory?
They can go to Albert Guillory for Lieutenant Governor, or albertguillory.com, Albert Guillory Facebook.
Okay, and spell Guillory for people so they can, because it is a mouthful sometimes.
Yes. First, Albert, E-L-B-E-R-T. Then Guillory, Albert Guillory.
Albert Guillory. Now, by the way, since we peripherally mentioned musicians, and Mark Frost is a drummer, Albert, but Mark, just peripherally, as a side note, are you a fan of Stanton Moore at all? You familiar with him?
I'm not.
I would look him up. Stanton Moore's a New Orleans drummer. He's a very good drummer. He does a lot of workshops and stuff, but he's a very good, you'd be impressed. He's a very good player, Stanton Moore. So I'll just throw that out there. He's a New Orleans drummer of some renown. He's an endorsee for Bosphorus Cymbals as well. That's how I became aware of him.
Oh, okay.
But he's quite a player as well, so check him out. Anybody, if you go to YouTube, I'm sure you'll be able to find Stanton Moore on there. Now, Albert, let's talk about the recent push that Joe Biden says and all the Democrats say are for voting rights. And Joe Biden was just down in Mark Frost. Mark's in Georgia. He was just in Mark's neck of the woods making a speech that was roundly criticized. We had Jamie Lovegrove from South Carolina on last hour talking about Tim Scott's reaction to it. And Tim Scott found it insulting to the civil rights legacy. Since you were there and involved in the civil rights struggle, Albert, what did you think of Joe Biden's speech on voting rights in Atlanta a couple of days ago? What was your take on that?
I found it disappointing. I was just so disappointed to hear the President of the United States doing this kind of political pandering that Biden is doing. It's disgusting to see and hear. If we must protect the rights of voters. If we do nutty things like some Democrats are doing now, permitting illegal persons to vote, that's a destruction of the rights of people in America. If we permit people to vote harvest, that is, you can mail in, people can go into neighborhoods and help people fill out their ballots, fill out the ballots for them, whether they're alive or dead, and then mail them in masse. That's something that we cannot afford to permit. One vote, every citizen should be able to vote, and there should be time to vote early voting. But after 8 o'clock on the night of the election, that's it. All the votes are in. We need to count those votes. And there should not be the kinds of frauds that we have seen. There was a lady in New Orleans, and this is on the record. She was picked up with a bunch of other people, put on a van. There were about 20 people on this van, and they would go from precinct to precinct, and at each precinct they'd be handed a card, not an ID card, just a name. And they'd go in and they would vote that person. They'd get paid each time they voted and got back on the bus. We cannot have that kind of fraud. We must have integrity in our elections. And what Biden is doing is trying to destroy election integrity and permit wide open Democrat fraud.
Now, Albert, I'm just going to ask you one thing, too. This has been a long time point the Democrats have made. Now, you're black. Why have you never been able to get? Why do black people can't get driver's licenses? What's wrong with black folks where they can't? Because you've heard Democrats say this, that somehow getting a driver's license is apparently beyond the ability of black folks, almost genetically, the way they describe it. It's got to be racist if you want people to have a driver's license or some form of ID. So when you hear that, am I right? Or is that it? If literally, if I came out and I said, well, Albert, he's black, he can't get a driver's, he can't figure out how to get ID, that I'm effectively calling you stupid. But if I'm a Democrat and I do that for the entire race, somehow someone's not getting slapped for that. You see the problem, Albert? I mean, is that really an insult to say that black folks can't get driver's licenses or ID?
That is exactly a part of what I'm talking about as being disgusting. We have, in order to get food stamps, you have to have an ID. In order to get into a hospital, you have to have an ID. In order to see a doctor, you have to have an ID. In order to get on an airplane, you have to have an ID. In order to get welfare, you have to have an ID. For everything except to vote? Is that stupid? That man, well, I'm not going to say more about him because I'm a Baptist preacher and I'm also a Navy veteran, and sometimes those nautical terms want to bubble up into my throat.
Well, I'll tell you what you can say, because we talked about this earlier. Just say bless his heart, and then I think you're covered, right? Because
that's
then
what we do in Georgia.
Right.
Cannot ask upon.
Bless his heart means the same thing in Louisiana it does in Georgia, right? You don't want to hear someone say, oh, bless his heart, right?
Yes. I cannot say that. My lips form to say bless Biden's heart, Biden's heart.
Yeah, bless Brandon's heart. Then you're speaking in complete obvious code then, as everyone would know what you're talking about. Bless Brandon's heart. That could be your campaign slogan right there.
I don't want to speak ill of any politician, but it's very difficult when people come up with some nutty ideas that are anti-American, anti-God, anti-family. When they are the purveyors of those kinds of policies and ideas, it's difficult not to speak ill of them.
Well, yeah, especially, and you're older than Joe Biden, aren't you, Albert?
Yes, I'm 77 and a half.
Right, and Joe Biden is what, 34? No, he's not quite. He's a little older than that. But my point is, it's kind of insulting too when people put whatever's going on with him just down to his age. Yes, age. You know, I'm getting older. I'm not getting any younger. I'm going to be 57 years old this year, but I'm not getting any younger. But I'm not Joe Biden, for God's sakes. And not only that, as an eloquent speaker, Albert, the other thing about Biden's speech, he was not on his game that day, was he?
No, he was not. Now, Biden has never been a great orator. He's never been a great intellectual. He's never been even a good senator or a public servant. And he gives old people a bad name.
Well, that was exactly the point. Hey, Albert, good luck with your run for lieutenant governor. Let's have you on again real soon. Mark Frost on Frosty Fridays. Great job co-hosting with Jamie Lovegrove. Let's thank him. And let's thank our intrepid producer, Rod, for putting this whole thing together, and our multifaceted engineer, Saul. We will be back Tuesday. I'm Lee Stranahan. You've been listening to The Backstory.